So imagine creating a surgical procedure that is I mean, so devastating that it essentially turns tens of thousands of human beings into emotional zombies.
Right.
And then imagine the global scientific community looking at that massive trail of shattered personalities and deciding to just, hand you the Nobel Prize in medicine for it.
I mean, it sounds like a dystopian science fiction novel, but it is actually one of the most baffling, well-documented medical realities of the 20th century.
Yeah.
I got the files spread out all over the table here, like old psychiatric journals, congressional inquiries, the actual Nobel Committee notes, and I still struggle to comprehend how this became standard practice.
We've been sitting in this coffee shop for hours poring over these case files, and the vibe is just incredibly heavy tonight. Pull up a chair because you are not going to believe what we're looking at for this deep dive.
It really is heavy.
Usually when we do a deep dive into a historical cold case, we're looking for a hidden motive. A single mastermind in a dark alley somewhere. But today, the scene of the crime is the highest, most respected halls of global medicine.
We're talking about the prefrontal lobotomy.
Yes, a procedure that intentionally mutilated the brains of some of the most vulnerable people in society.
And it forces us to ask some deeply uncomfortable what-ifs about history and science. Like, what if the standard of care today, the things we accept as totally normal medical interventions right now, are viewed as completely barbaric 50 years from now?
That is a terrifying thought, and I'm so stuck on the timeline of all this. The who, the when, and the where. How does a doctor scramble someone's frontal lobes and walk away with the world's most prestigious scientific award?
Right.
But you've been digging into the mechanics, the how, and the why. How does a procedure like this even get off the ground, let alone become universally accepted?
Well, to understand the why, you have to completely strip away your modern understanding of medicine. You have to put yourself in the vacuum of hope that existed in psychiatry before the 1950s.
Okay, set the scene for us.
If you try to judge the origins of this from the perspective of a 21st century hospital, it just looks like pure malice. But it wasn't malice. It was sheer, unadulterated desperation.
So we are going back to the 1930s, and the scene of the crime is the state-run psychiatric asylum.
Yeah.
When we read the source materials describing these facilities, it's like something out of a horror movie. They were massively overcrowded, critically understaffed, and their budgets were stretched so thin they were essentially just warehousing human beings.
Warehousing is the perfect word. I mean, if you had a family member in the 1930s suffering from severe schizophrenia, debilitating clinical depression, or uncontrollable paranoia, your options were practically non-existent.
You just drop them off.
Exactly. You drop off a loved one at one of these massive brick institutions, the doors lock behind them, and there is almost zero hope of them ever returning to society.
Because they had no effective medications. I think that's hard for us to grasp today.
Oh, totally.
We are so used to the idea that if you have a psychiatric episode, a doctor prescribes a pill to balance your brain chemistry. That just did not exist.
Zero psychiatric drugs. The first true antipsychotic doesn't hit the market until the 1950s. So what do you do with a ward of 300 patients who are hallucinating, screaming, violent, or profoundly catatonic?
You try whatever you can.
Right. The treatments they did have were what we call early somatic treatments. They were trying to treat the physical body to somehow shock the mind into healing.
And these somatic treatments, they read like literal torture. Let's talk about hydrotherapy, because I think people hear that word today and picture a luxury day spa.
Oh, it was the exact opposite of a spa.
Oh.
Psychiatric hydrotherapy in the 1930s often meant taking a manic patient, forcing them into a canvas tub, and submerging them in continuous water baths for hours, sometimes days at a time. Yeah. They would stretch canvas over the top of the tub with just a hole for the head so the patient couldn't get out. The idea was that the temperature of the water would eventually exhaust them into a calm state.
That sounds like a nightmare. Or insulin shock therapy. The sources detail doctors intentionally injecting massive, life-threatening doses of insulin into patients.
Which crashes their blood sugar to the point where they go into a hypoglycemic coma.
On purpose.
On purpose.
Yeah.
They would induce these comas daily. The patient would sweat, thrash around, go unconscious, and then the doctors would bring them back by pumping glucose into their stomachs through a tube.
Wow.
The prevailing theory was that this massive shock to the nervous system would somehow, reset the brain's pathways.
It sounds like taking a computer that's glitching and just unplugging it from the wall over and over, hoping it boots up normally when you plug it back in.
That's a great way to put it. And then there was early electroconvulsive therapy, or ECT.
Right, shock therapy.
Now, to be fair, ECT is still used today, but it is highly refined, done under general anesthesia, and it's very safe and effective for treatment-resistant depression. But in the 1930s, it was incredibly crude.
Because they were awake, right?
Fully awake. The electrical doses were totally uncalibrated, and the induced seizures were so violent that patients frequently broke their own bones, including their spines, just from the muscle contraction.
Breaking your own spine from a seizure. And the tragic reality of all these extreme measures is that they rarely cured anyone.
Exactly.
They might interrupt a manic episode or make a patient temporarily docile, which obviously made them easier for the understaffed asylum workers to manage, but the underlying illness remained.
So I pose the question to you. If you are the chief medical officer of one of these institutions and you walk the halls every day seeing thousands of people tormented by their own minds living in straitjackets, and suddenly a surgical procedure is proposed that promises to send them home, even if it's untested, even if it involves drilling into their skull, wouldn't you feel an ethical obligation to at least look at it?
I mean, I understand the desperation, I really do. But there has to be a line. You don't jump from, we are desperate, to, let's start carving out pieces of the brain without knowing what they actually do. Even in the 1930s, the scientific method existed. You don't just throw out basic ethical frameworks because you're overwhelmed.
But the framework itself was shifting. Psychiatry was undergoing a massive identity crisis at the time.
How so?
For decades, the field had been dominated by psychoanalysis. You know, the Freudian idea that mental illness was a psychological issue, a problem of the mind, of unresolved trauma or subconscious conflict.
Right, laying on a couch talking about your dream.
Exactly. But by the 1930s, a new wave of doctors was pushing a biological view of psychiatry.
Meaning they believed mental illness was a physical disease? Like a broken part in a machine?
Exactly. They started to view severe psychiatric conditions as biological defects of the brain tissue itself. And the logic follows, if a disease is a physical anatomical defect, you don't talk it out on a couch. You cut it out on an operating table.
It requires a surgical solution.
Right.
Okay, so the kindling is laid, you have desperate doctors, overflowing asylums, and a new theory that mental illness is a physical brain defect. The stage is set for a miracle cure.
It really is.
But the spark that ignites this entire lobotomy epidemic doesn't come from human trials or some breakthrough in a hospital. It comes from two chimpanzees in London.
Yep. August 1935. The Second International Neurological Congress in London. This is basically the Super Bowl for the brightest neurological minds in the world. Everyone who is anyone in brain science is in attendance.
Including two American researchers from Yale, John Fulton and Carlisle Jacobson. They take the stage to present the results of an experiment they've been running on two chimpanzees, named Becky and Lucy.
And what Fulton and Jacobson did was perform bilateral lobectomies on these animals. They physically removed portions of the chimp's frontal lobes.
Just took them out.
Yeah. Now, to give context, before the surgery, these chimpanzees were highly intelligent, but incredibly temperamental. Becky, in particular, would throw massive violent tantrums if she made a mistake during a complex puzzle test, or if she failed to get a food reward. Just standard primate frustration.
But the presentation in London shows that post-surgery, these chimps are completely transformed. They are docile. They no longer get upset when they make mistakes. The aggression is just gone.
They called it a state of experimental neurosis that had been cured by the surgery.
And sitting in the audience watching this presentation about calm monkeys is a man named Antonio Egas Moniz.
The mastermind.
Exactly. And we need to talk about Moniz because he is the mastermind of this whole story. He's a Portuguese neurologist, 61 years old at the time of this conference, and he is not some fringe quack working out of a basement.
Not at all. He's a giant of Portuguese medicine and society. He's an aristocrat, brilliantly ambitious. He had actually been Portugal's Minister of Foreign Affairs, led their delegation at the Paris Peace Conference in 1918 after World War I.
Wait, really?
Yeah. The sources even note he fought a formal duel over a political quarrel.
A duel? He sounds incredibly dramatic. He clearly has a massive ego and is used to being the center of attention.
He is a man who swings for the fences. And scientifically, he already had a massive victory under his belt. In 1927, Moniz invented cerebral angiography.
Okay, what is that?
This was revolutionary. Before this, you couldn't see the blood vessels in a living human brain. Moniz figured out how to inject a radio-opaque dye into the carotid artery in the neck and then quickly take an X-ray.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, the dye made the brain's vascular network light up on the film.
That sounds like a legitimate, brilliant contribution to medicine. It allowed doctors to actually diagnose brain tumors and aneurysms without having to open the skull blindly.
It was brilliant. It saved countless lives. And he was actually nominated for the Nobel Prize twice for that invention in 1928 and 1933, but he didn't win.
Ah. So he's sitting in London in 1935. He's 61. He's already tasted massive success, but missed out on the ultimate prize, and he's hungry for his next breakthrough.
Very hungry.
He sees these calm chimpanzees, and he immediately hypothesizes that the same principle could cure human beings of severe anxiety and paranoia.
But he has to explain how it would work in humans.
Yeah.
You can't just say it made the monkey calm. You need a mechanism.
Right.
And this is where the science gets incredibly flimsy. Moniz essentially invents a theory out of thin air. He hypothesizes that mental illnesses like obsessive-compulsive disorder or severe paranoia were caused by an abnormal stickiness in the nerve cells of the frontal lobes.
Sticky neurons. I'm trying to wrap my head around this. What does that even mean?
He theorized that neural impulses, the electrical signals traveling through the brain, were getting stuck in repetitive loops. He called them constellations of neuron patterns. So if you have a paranoid delusion, Moniz believed the electrical signal for that delusion was just firing over and over in a closed loop in the frontal lobe, trapping the patient in that state.
It sounds like a record player skipping. The needle gets stuck in a groove and it just plays the same 2 seconds of music forever.
That is a perfect analogy. He believed the physical circuitry was locked. And to understand why anyone bought this, we have to look back at the Goltz-Ferrier debates of 1881. This was a massive argument in the medical community about brain mapping.
Break that down for me, because this seems central to how they justified the surgery.
For a long time, there were two competing theories. One was equipotentiality, the idea that the brain functioned as a single holistic unit. If you damage part of it, the rest of the brain could supposedly pick up the slack.
Okay.
The competing theory was localization of function, the idea that the brain is like a machine with very specific, highly specialized departments.
Right, like the visual cortex handles sight, the motor cortex handles movement.
Exactly. David Ferrier, a Scottish neurologist, essentially won this debate in 1881 by showing that if you created localized lesions, small, targeted injuries in specific parts of a monkey's brain, you could cause a specific physical deficit, like paralyzing a single leg, without affecting the rest of the animal.
Okay, so the medical community accepts that the brain has specific departments.
Right. Moniz takes that accepted fact of physical localization and applies it to complex psychiatric conditions. He theorized that the frontal lobes were the department where these sticky, diseased thoughts lived.
I see where this is going.
And if he could physically sever the wiring connecting the frontal lobe to the rest of the brain, he could break that skipping record. He could destroy the diseased constellations of neuron patterns without destroying the patient's overall intellect.
But hold on. Ferrier proved localization for basic motor functions. Paralyzing a leg is a mechanical, measurable thing. Complex human emotion, paranoia, the nature of consciousness. You can't just pinpoint that to a single millimeter of tissue.
No, you can't.
There was no empiric evidence for his sticky neurons theory, like none. So he just sees a calm monkey, invents a theory about sticky nerves, and goes straight to human trials.
You're completely right. It was almost entirely speculative. It was an elegant metaphor masquerading as biological science. But Moniz didn't care about the lack of proof. He rushed back to Portugal to test it.
Which brings us to the actual scene of the first procedures. November 1935, Lisbon. Just 3 months after he saw those chimps in London. 3 months.
It's remarkably fast.
He didn't spend years doing clinical trials or testing his theory on animal models. He went straight to human beings.
And there was a massive physical hurdle he had to overcome. Moniz couldn't perform the surgery himself. By this time, his hands were severely crippled by gout.
Oh, wow.
His fingers were so deformed he literally could not hold a scalpel or a drill.
I find that detail so eerie. The architect of this massive surgical movement never actually held the knife. He stood in the room and directed his younger colleague, a neurosurgeon named Pedro Almeida Lima, to do the physical cutting.
Yes, Almeida Lima became his hands. On November 12, 1935, they performed the first procedure on a 63-year-old woman. She was a former prostitute who had suffered from a long, documented history of severe depression, paranoia, hallucinations, and chronic insomnia. She was deeply institutionalized.
And the physical reality of this first surgery is so gritty. If we think about neurosurgery today, we picture functional MRIs, computer mapping, microscopic lasers.
They had none of that. They were flying completely blind.
So what did they actually do?
Almeida Lima shaved the patient's head, administered general anesthesia, and physically drilled 2 holes called burr holes into the top of her skull, right above the forehead.
And what did they do once they were inside? Because they didn't have a specialized tool for this yet.
He didn't. Moniz's goal was to destroy the white matter connecting the frontal lobe to the thalamus.
Let's pause and define those terms, because they are crucial. The thalamus and the white matter.
Okay, think of the thalamus as the brain's emotional engine room. It's a deep structure that processes raw sensory input and emotional signals. The frontal lobe, sitting right behind your forehead, is the executive control center. It handles logic, impulse control, personality, and complex decision-making.
So the thalamus is the engine generating raw emotion, and the frontal lobe is the steering wheel and the brakes.
Exactly. And the white matter is the physical wiring, the thick bundles of nerve fibers that connect the engine to the steering wheel.
Got it.
Moniz theorized that if he cut those wires, the overwhelming emotional signals from the thalamus wouldn't reach the frontal lobe, and the patient's anxiety would vanish.
But for that very first surgery, they didn't cut the wires. They burned them chemically.
Right. Because they lacked a cutting tool, Almeida Lima inserted a needle through the burr holes, deep into the brain tissue, and injected absolute alcohol directly into the subcortical white matter.
Pure alcohol.
The goal was to induce sclerosis, essentially to chemically burn and harden the tissue, destroying those nerve pathways.
It sounds like pouring a bottle of bleach directly onto a computer's motherboard to stop a software glitch.
It's not far off. And they quickly realized the alcohol was too unpredictable. Fluid travels. It could seep into areas of the brain they didn't want to damage, causing catastrophic unintended consequences.
Naturally.
So Moniz, who is a genuinely inventive guy, designs a mechanical solution. He invents an instrument he calls the leucotome.
Leucotomy literally translates from Greek as white cut, targeting that white matter.
Exactly. The leucotome was a long, hollow needle with a retractable wire loop at the tip.
So the mechanics are they drill the holes, insert this needle blind into the brain, push a button on the handle, which extends this wire loop out of the tip, and then they literally rotate the instrument to core out a chunk of brain tissue, like an apple corer.
That is the exact mechanism. They would make several of these cores in both hemispheres of the frontal lobe. And here is one of the most unsettling details. They didn't even extract the tissue they cored out.
Wait, what?
They left those severed chunks of white matter floating free inside the skull cavity. Moniz wrote that the tissue would simply autodigest and be absorbed by the body.
That is horrifying. It is blind, irreversible destruction. They're basically estimating the depth based on the external shape of the skull. If they push a little too far, they sever a major blood vessel.
But despite the profound crudeness of the method, the immediate post-operative results seemed, to Moniz, like a massive triumph.
Of course they did.
That first patient woke up. 2 months later, a psychiatric evaluation noted she was significantly calmer, her paranoia had receded, and she was well-oriented.
And Moniz does not wait around to see if she develops long-term complications. He doesn't wait to see if the paranoia comes back. After operating on a grand total of just 20 patients, he rushes to publish a monograph in early 1936.
Yep. He announces to the global medical community that out of his first 20 cases, 7 were fully cured, 7 showed significant clinical improvement, and 6 remained unchanged.
And he actually claimed it was safe.
He boldly declares, prefrontal leucotomy is a simple operation, always safe, which may prove to be an effective surgical treatment in certain cases of mental disorder.
Always safe. Based on 20 patients observed for a few weeks or months. He operated, waited just a few weeks, and declared it a medical triumph to the world. The sheer hubris is staggering.
The lack of long-term follow-up is the fatal flaw in his methodology. He evaluated these patients immediately after massive brain trauma. Of course, they were calmer. They were recovering from a severe induced brain injury.
Right, they were probably just stunned.
Exactly. He drastically overestimated the therapeutic improvements, and he completely ignored or downplayed the subtle, devastating long-term cognitive deficits that were emerging.
And we also have to talk about the ethical nightmare of informed consent, because I want you, the listener, to consider this. These were severely mentally ill patients living in state institutions.
Right.
They were experiencing delusions. They were in absolutely no position to understand, let alone consent to, irreversible brain mutilation. Who is making the call?
Usually family members, if they were involved, or frequently just the hospital administrator.
Unbelievable.
The concept of rigorous informed consent, as we understand it today, the lengthy paperwork, the full disclosure of risks, the patient bill of rights that simply did not exist in the 1930s. The doctor was viewed as the ultimate, unquestionable authority.
So Moniz publishes this overly optimistic, scientifically flimsy monograph. He lights the match. But it's an American doctor who sees that match, runs over, and pours a barrel of gasoline on it.
Yeah, he really did.
We are shifting from a specialized, albeit crude, surgical procedure in a Lisbon operating room to what essentially became an outpatient assembly line in the United States.
Entered Dr. Walter J. Freeman.
If Moniz is the mastermind, Walter Freeman is the evangelist.
Freeman is a fascinating, deeply problematic figure. He was a prominent physician, trained in neurology and psychiatry. He wasn't a surgeon himself, so he partnered with a skilled neurosurgeon named Dr. James Watts. They read Moniz's 1936 monograph and immediately, within months, adopted the procedure in the U.S.
They modify it slightly and brand it the Freeman-Watts standard prefrontal lobotomy.
Right. They stylize it as a more precise method than Moniz's wire loop. Watts would drill the holes in the side of the skull and use a blunt surgical instrument, sort of resembling a butter knife, to make sweeping cuts through the white matter.
But crucially, this standard lobotomy still required an operating room, general anesthesia, sterile fields, and an actual board-certified neurosurgeon to perform it.
Which was a massive bottleneck for Freeman.
Why?
It was the central problem for him. Freeman wasn't interested in a boutique procedure for a few dozen patients in a private hospital. He looked at the massive state asylums across America facilities with thousands of patients, but no operating suites and no neurosurgeons on staff.
Oh, I see.
He realized that if the lobotomy required a neurosurgeon, it could never solve the institutional crisis. He needed a method that any regular psychiatrist could perform quickly, safely, on a standard hospital bed.
So he goes searching for a shortcut. And the sources say he was inspired by an Italian psychiatrist named Amaro Fiamberti, who had experimented with accessing the brain through the eye sockets to inject chemicals. Freeman takes that concept and, in 1945, invents the transorbital lobotomy.
Transorbital, meaning across or through the orbit, the eye socket.
And the origin story of this technique, you honestly could not pitch this in a Hollywood script because it sounds too absurd. He developed the physical technique in his own kitchen.
He literally took an ordinary ice pick out of his kitchen drawer.
An ice pick.
He brought home grapefruits, and he would plunge the ice pick into the grapefruits to simulate the physical resistance of punching through the thin bone of the human eye socket.
That is just wild.
Once he felt confident with the grapefruits, he moved on to practicing on cadavers in the hospital morgue.
We really need to break down the physical mechanics of the transorbital lobotomy because it bypassed the skull entirely, which was Freeman's major innovation.
Right. The human skull is incredibly thick at the top and sides. That's why neurosurgeons need heavy drills to get through it. But the bone at the very top of your eye socket, just under your eyebrow, is called the orbital plate, and it is paper thin.
It's super fragile.
Exactly. Freeman realized it was a direct, easily breakable gateway to the frontal lobes.
So walk us through the actual procedure. A patient is brought into a room. They don't have an anesthesiologist.
No anesthesiologist. To subdue the patient, Freeman utilized the electroconvulsive therapy machines they already had in the asylum. He would administer a massive, localized electrical shock to the patient's head.
So he shocked them into a grand mal seizure, and the resulting unconsciousness served as his anesthesia.
Precisely. While the patient is unconscious and convulsing on the table, the doctor steps up to the head of the bed. They pull up the patient's upper eyelid.
Right.
They take a sharp, pick-like instrument. Freeman later refined the ice pick into a specialized surgical tool he patented as the orbitoclast. They slide the point of the instrument under the eyelid, resting it right against the thin orbital plate at the roof of the eye socket.
And then he takes a mallet.
He takes a small, specialized mallet, and he taps the blunt end of the instrument. The sharp point easily punctures the thin bone, and the doctor drives the instrument about 2 inches deep, straight into the frontal lobe of the brain.
It's agonizing just to visualize it. It's so violent.
And once the instrument is 2 inches deep inside the brain tissue, the doctor doesn't just pull it out. They physically sweep the handle back and forth. They move it 40 degrees laterally, sweeping it through the brain tissue to blindly sever those thick white matter cables connecting the prefrontal cortex to the thalamus.
Oh my God.
Once they feel the resistance give way, they withdraw the instrument, move to the other eye, and do the exact same thing.
And the entire process from shock to pulling the pick out of the second eye
Takes less than 10 minutes,
Yeah.
sometimes less than 5.
Huh?
No sterile operating suite, no shaving the head. The patient wakes up an hour later with 2 massive black eyes, which Freeman called raccoon eyes, and a permanently altered personality.
It was so fast, so utterly terrifying in its simplicity, that Freeman's own partner, the neurosurgeon Dr. Watts, walked away.
Watts walked into an examining room one day and saw Freeman, a psychiatrist with no surgical training, plunging an instrument into a patient's eye socket.
He must have been stunned.
Watts was horrified. He believed it was reckless, blind, and barbaric. He ended their partnership over it. He said, "Any procedure that involves cutting brain tissue belongs in an operating room, not an office."
But Freeman didn't care. He was unburdened by Watts. He became a traveling salesman for the procedure. He actually bought a camper van, packed his mallets in orbitoclass, and traveled the country. He called his van the Lobotomobile.
Yeah, he really leaned into the branding. He visited state hospitals across the country. He would perform dozens of transorbital lobotomies in a single afternoon.
Dozens.
And he wasn't just doing the surgery. He was holding clinics to teach the local asylum psychiatrists how to do it themselves. He wanted to democratize the lobotomy.
And he was such a showman about it. The sources describe him performing for galleries of visiting doctors. He would sometimes do the surgery two-handed, holding an ice pick in each hand, driving them into both eyes simultaneously just to show off his ambidexterity and speed.
He craved the attention. He invited the press. He wanted to be seen as the man who was emptying the asylums and solving America's mental health crisis.
But here's the question I keep coming back to. Why was America so quick to adopt this? Even in the 1940s, before we had the FDA regulations we have today, a hospital administrator has to look at a guy with a carpenter's mallet and an ice pick and think, this is absolutely insane. How did this become the standard of care?
It's a crucial question, and the answer lies in the psychology and societal pressures of mid-century America. We already talked about the physical desperation of the overcrowded asylums. But beyond that, there was a profound cultural obsession with productivity and conformity.
The post-WWII era.
Exactly. The post-WWII in America was highly focused on returning to a stable, productive, compliant society.
Right. And Freeman tapped directly into that ethos. Our sources mention his use of something called a life chart to evaluate whether a surgery was successful.
The life chart is one of the most revealing documents in this whole history. Freeman didn't measure success by whether a patient felt internal joy, or if they regained their creative spark, or if their complex emotional life was restored.
So what did he measure?
He categorized patients strictly by social utility. Were they employed? Were they keeping house? Or were they institutionalized?
So if a patient was violently schizophrenic, costing the state money in an asylum and post-lobotomy, they became utterly docile, went home, and could silently fold laundry or sweep a floor for the rest of their lives. Freeman checked the success box.
A massive medical triumph in his eyes. The fact that the patient was emotionally flattened, that their personality was gone, that they were a hollow shell of their former self, that was considered a perfectly acceptable trade-off for societal compliance.
Because they were no longer a burden on the state. He actually had a specific term for this state. He called it a surgically induced childhood.
That phrase gives me chills. He openly admitted that the operation stripped away the patient's adult personality. He believed the adult personality had become diseased and too complex to function.
So he just erases it.
Right. By severing the frontal lobes, he believed he was reducing them to an infantile personality. His theory was that they would then undergo a period of rapid maturation, growing a new, healthier, albeit much simpler, personality.
It is the ultimate arrogance, to believe you can carve away someone's soul and they'll just grow a better one. There's a quote in the files that is just haunting. He was describing a 29-year-old female patient after a lobotomy. He wrote in his notes that she was a smiling, lazy, and satisfactory patient with the personality of an oyster.
An oyster.
He turned a human being into a literal bivalve, something that just sits there passively, and he published that as a glowing success story.
And the follow-up advice he gave to families is equally disturbing. When the parents of that young woman complained to Freeman that she was severely impaired, like she couldn't remember his name, she would endlessly pour coffee from an empty pot, she couldn't function. Freeman's response wasn't alarm.
What did he say?
He simply advised the parents to treat her like a toddler. He told them to use a strict system of rewards and punishments. Ice cream for good behavior, physical smacks for bad behavior.
He lobotomized them, sent them home, and told the families to treat their adult children like pets. And this brings us to the grim, sprawling reality of how far this escalated. Because the bodies and the shattered families started piling up fast.
The statistics are almost hard to comprehend. Between 1949 and 1952 alone, around 50,000 lobotomies were performed in the United States.
50,000.
And as the procedure became easier to perform with the transorbital method, the diagnostic criteria began to expand wildly.
It wasn't just for severe institutionalized schizophrenia anymore.
Not at all. It became a terrifying catch-all. Doctors began prescribing it for severe depression, anxiety, obsessive-compulsive disorder. Then it expanded to things that aren't even illnesses.
Like what?
It was used on rebellious adolescents who were acting out. It was used on people deemed simply difficult or unmanageable by their families.
And it crossed all societal boundaries. It wasn't just the wards of the state. It touched the highest echelons of society. You have famous tragedies like the Hollywood actress Frances Farmer, whose story became infamous. You have Rose Williams, the beloved older sister of the legendary playwright Tennessee Williams.
Rose's case is heartbreaking. She suffered from schizophrenia, and her parents authorized the lobotomy. It left her completely incapacitated for the rest of her life.
That's so sad.
Tennessee Williams was so profoundly traumatized by what happened to his sister that the guilt and horror of the lobotomy bled into his work. You see the themes of institutionalization and brain mutilation heavily in his play, Suddenly Last Summer.
But the single most notable case, the tragedy that most perfectly exposes the dark intersection of medical hubris, societal pressure, and familial shame, is Rosemary Kennedy.
The sister of the future President of the United States, John F. Kennedy.
We really need to look at her story in depth because her tragedy actually begins at the exact moment of her birth, long before she ever met Dr. Freeman. Rosemary was born in 1918.
Okay.
During her mother's labor, the attending doctor was delayed. He wasn't at the house yet. And the attending nurse, strictly following the protocol that only a doctor could deliver the child, literally ordered Rose Kennedy to keep her legs closed.
It's an agonizing detail. The nurse actually reached in and forced the baby's head back up into the birth canal, holding Rosemary inside for 2 excruciating hours until the doctor finally arrived.
2 hours of delayed birth, and the result was exactly what modern medicine would predict: a massive, harmful loss of oxygen to Rosemary's brain. So from the very beginning, she suffered from cognitive delays and intellectual disabilities. But as she grew into a young adult in the late 1930s, the accounts describe her as outgoing, beautiful, and deeply affectionate. She loved going to dances.
But she was fundamentally out of step with the Kennedy family dynamic.
Yeah.
Her father, Joseph Kennedy Sr., had cultivated this hyper-competitive, fiercely intelligent, goal-oriented environment for his children. Rosemary couldn't keep up.
No, she couldn't.
And as she reached her early 20s, the frustration mounted. She started having severe mood swings, erratic behavior. She would sneak out of her convent school at night.
And Joseph Kennedy Sr. was a man with massive political ambitions. He was grooming his sons for the White House. He viewed Rosemary's behavior not as a medical crisis to be nurtured, but as a severe political liability.
A threat to the brand.
Exactly. He was terrified that she would sneak out, meet a man, get pregnant out of wedlock, and the resulting scandal would destroy the family's political legacy forever.
So he went searching for a solution to neutralize the threat. And in 1941, when Rosemary was just 23 years old, Joseph Kennedy sought out Dr. Walter Freeman. Without consulting his wife, Rose, he authorized a lobotomy for his daughter.
The details of this specific surgery are heavily documented, and they are incredibly chilling. This was 1941, so it was before Freeman invented the ice pick method. This was the Freeman-Watts standard lobotomy.
So she was in an operating room.
Right. Dr. Watts shaved a portion of her head and drilled the burr holes.
And crucially, she was awake.
She was fully awake. They gave her a mild tranquilizer to calm her and local anesthesia so her scalp wouldn't feel the pain of the drill. But the brain itself has no pain receptors.
Wow.
So Dr. Watts is standing over her, inserting a surgical instrument that looked like a butter knife deep into her brain tissue, physically slicing through the white matter.
And while Watts is cutting the physical brain, Freeman is standing near her face, conducting the psychological evaluation in real time.
Right. And how did he evaluate it? What was the metric for when to stop cutting?
Freeman engages Rosemary in conversation. He asks her to recite the Lord's Prayer. He asks her to sing popular songs, like God Bless America. He asked her to count backwards from 10.
So they were essentially flying blind. They didn't have functional MRIs or brain monitors, so they were literally using her ability to sing a nursery rhyme as a real-time, crude barometer for how much of her brain they were destroying.
That is exactly what they were doing. Dr. Watts later recounted the surgery in a deeply disturbing interview. He said, "We made an estimate on how far to cut based on how she responded."
Wait, they judged it based on that?
Yeah. So Watts would make a cut. Freeman would say, "Sing for me, Rosemary." She would sing. So Watts would make another deeper cut. They kept severing more and more of her frontal lobe connections, destroying the pathways of her mind.
Until she couldn't sing anymore.
Until she became incoherent. Her speech began to slur, and then it stopped altogether. Once she was essentially muted, Freeman told Watts to stop cutting. They considered the procedure complete.
Wait, they literally judged how much of her brain to destroy based on when she stopped singing. That's horrific. It is playing God with a butter knife. And the result for Rosemary was absolutely catastrophic.
Completely.
The procedure wasn't a success even by Freeman's twisted standards. It was a total devastating failure. Rosemary's mental capacity diminished immediately to that of a 2-year-old child.
She lost the ability to walk. She lost the ability to speak intelligible words. She lost control of her bodily functions and became completely incontinent. She went from a beautiful, vibrant 23-year-old who loved going to dances to someone who needed round-the-clock infant care.
And what did her father do? Joe Sr. realized the liability hadn't been fixed, it had been magnified. So he institutionalized her and hid her away from the public eye.
Just erased her from the family.
Our sources say he never visited her again. Her siblings didn't even know where she was or what had happened to her for years. She lived the rest of her life until she died at the age of 86 in 2005, hidden away in a private Catholic institution in Wisconsin.
Rosemary's tragedy is the most high-profile example of the dark reality that was quietly playing out across thousands of families. It became known clinically as frontal lobe syndrome.
Right.
While Freeman was traveling the country, touting his successes and publishing his life charts, independent researchers and neurologists started documenting the true, horrific aftermath of these surgeries.
Let's break down frontal lobe syndrome. Because it wasn't just calmness, it was profound damage.
It manifested as profound apathy, a total loss of spontaneity, initiative, and human drive.
Yeah.
Patients lost their ability to plan for the future. They lacked self-awareness and self-control. They were emotionally blunt. If you told them a tragic story, they wouldn't cry. If you told a joke, they wouldn't laugh.
The sources also note bizarre physical side effects. Some patients developed an enormous, insatiable appetite. They would eat until they were physically sick, lacking the impulse control to stop, and became severely obese.
And there were massive physical dangers. This wasn't a safe procedure. 10 to 25% of lobotomized patients developed severe epilepsy and massive seizures months or even years after the surgery, directly caused by the scar tissue forming in their brains.
And people died.
Yes. There was an average immediate mortality rate of 2 to 5%. Patients were dying on the table from massive intracranial hemorrhaging when the blade struck a blood vessel, or dying weeks later from deep brain abscesses and infections because Freeman was literally jamming a non-sterile ice pick through their eye sockets.
So as the bodies are dropping, as thousands of people are manifesting this frontal lobe syndrome, surely the medical community starts pushing back. I mean, you can't just blindfold an entire profession forever.
The pushback did happen, but it was a painstakingly slow turning of the tide. And this brings us to the aftermath, the legal and scientific resistance. As early as 1941, the American Medical Association, the AMA, actually issued warnings in their journal.
Oh, they did?
Yeah, they cited the negative effects on personality, the apathy, the inappropriate social behavior. They warned doctors to be extremely cautious.
But doctors ignored the warning. The procedure remained massively popular, peaking in the late 40s and early 50s. If the AMA couldn't stop it, what did? Who was the first major player to actually slam the brakes on this?
Well, in a massive twist of historical irony, the first structural national defeat of the lobotomy didn't come from Western medical ethics boards. It came from a geopolitical rival. In 1950, the Soviet Union officially banned the lobotomy.
The USSR. In 1950, at the absolute dawn of the Cold War, the Soviet Union is the one taking the moral high ground on human rights in medicine.
It is incredibly ironic. The Soviet Ministry of Health issued a strict decree banning the procedure entirely across all Soviet territories. And the pushback was spearheaded by a very prominent Soviet psychiatrist named Vasily Gilyarovsky.
So what was their scientific rationale? I mean, I doubt Stalin's government banned it just to be bleeding heart humanitarians. There had to be a scientific or ideological reason.
There was, and it was deeply rooted in their prevailing medical philosophy. Soviet psychiatry at the time was heavily, almost exclusively, influenced by the theories of Ivan Pavlov.
Pavlov, the scientist famous for Pavlov's dogs, ringing the bell, classical conditioning.
Exactly. Pavlovian theory viewed the nervous system as a highly holistic, deeply integrated network. They believed that mental illness was a whole-body process. It was an issue of conditioning, of environmental stress interacting dynamically with the entire brain network over time.
So the idea of localized function, the idea that you can just take a knife and chop out the depression center of the brain, fundamentally offended their scientific worldview.
Kielirowski argued vehemently that severing brain tissue was a flawed, overly mechanistic, deeply Western approach. He said you cannot treat a complex systemic psychiatric illness by creating a permanent, organic structural brain injury. It was intellectually bankrupt to them.
The wording of the official Soviet decree is incredibly blunt. They didn't mince words. The decree states that the procedure is contrary to the principles of humanity and that through lobotomy, an insane person is changed into an idiot.
It's harsh, unsparing language. But clinically speaking, if you look at patients with severe frontal lobe syndrome, the Soviet assessment of the damage was entirely accurate.
So, at the height of the Cold War, the USSR is calling out the West for human rights violations in medicine. We have to remain objective here. If you're listening to this thinking, wow, the Soviets were the good guys here, we have to acknowledge the context. Was there a political, anti-Western propaganda motive behind the ban?
Almost certainly. The Cold War was escalating rapidly. The Soviet propaganda machine used the ban to paint Western medicine as barbaric, capitalist, and cruel. They framed it as American doctors prioritizing cheap, fast, factory-line cures over the genuine, time-consuming care of the human being.
They used it as ammunition.
Yes. But regardless of the political motives, their medical assessment of the lobotomy's damage was completely accurate. They recognized the ethical and biological nightmare long before the U.S. government or the FDA ever stepped in.
But ultimately, it wasn't the Soviet decree or even the AMA's gentle warnings that stopped Walter Freeman and his ice pick in the West.
No, it wasn't.
Because you can't argue away desperation. As long as the asylums were overflowing, and as long as families had nowhere else to turn, doctors were going to keep using the only tool they had, no matter how blunt or damaging it was.
Exactly. To stop the lobotomy, the medical community didn't need a moral awakening. They needed a better tool.
And that tool finally arrived. But it didn't come in the form of a new surgical instrument. It came in a bottle. Let's talk about the chemical revolution.
The definitive turning point is 1952. Over in France, a surgeon was experimenting with various antihistamines, trying to find a compound to calm patients down before general surgery. During these experiments, researchers synthesized a new drug called chlorpromazine.
And when it was brought to the United States, it was aggressively marketed under the brand name Thorazine.
Thorazine was the world's first true neuroleptic or antipsychotic medication, and it hit the psychiatric community like a tidal wave.
Let's do an ELI 5 on Thorazine. How does a chemical lobotomy, as it was sometimes called, actually work in the brain compared to an ice pick?
Well, Thorazine works by blocking specific neurotransmitter receptors in the brain, primarily dopamine receptors. In conditions like severe schizophrenia, the brain is flooded with excessive dopamine activity, which causes the terrifying hallucinations, the delusions, the severe agitation.
Okay, that makes sense.
Thorazine acts as a chemical dampener. It blocks those receptors, quieting the excessive noise.
So instead of physically severing the highway so the car can't drive, Thorazine just lowers the speed limit on the highway.
That's a brilliant way to conceptualize it. It offered a chemical systemic alternative to psychosurgery. It safely calms severely agitated patients. It actually reduced the hallucinations and delusions rather than just masking them with apathy.
Which is a huge difference.
And most importantly, the crucial difference, it didn't require drilling through a human skull or driving a mallet into an eye socket.
Right. And if the patient had an adverse reaction to the drug or if the side effects were too severe, you simply stopped giving them the pill. The dopamine receptors would eventually clear. You cannot unslice a frontal lobe.
Precisely. The reversibility was everything. Thorazine was initially dubbed the chemical lobotomy by the press, which just shows you how deeply entrenched the surgical mindset was in the culture. But the drug quickly rendered the physical lobotomy entirely obsolete.
Thank goodness.
By the mid-1950s, the number of surgeries plummeted drastically. And for the first time in history, the massive psychiatric hospitals finally began to empty out. Patients were actually going home, managing their illnesses with medication.
It's an incredible medical triumph, but it brings us to the grand paradox of this entire deep dive, the ultimate bitter irony of the lobotomy story. Just as the devastating, irreversible side effects are becoming undeniable, just as the Soviets are banning it for being barbaric, and just a few short years before Thorazine arrives, to prove there is a better way, Antonio Egas Moniz receives the ultimate validation.
In October 1949, the Nobel Foundation announces that they are awarding Moniz the Nobel Prize in Physiology or Medicine.
I am baffled by this. How does that happen? How does the highest, most rigorous scientific body in the world look at a trail of emotional zombies, look at a procedure based on a completely unproven theory of sticky neurons, and decide to hand the inventor a gold medal?
To understand the Nobel Committee's decision, you have to look very strictly at the timeline and the context of 1949. In 1949, Thorazine did not exist yet. The asylums were at their absolute breaking point worst.
True, they were packed.
They were overflowing not just with the chronically mentally ill, but with thousands of post-World War II veterans suffering from severe untreated trauma, what we now call PTSD. The medical system was collapsing.
So the Nobel Committee looked at Moniz and saw a guy who at least tried to do something.
Exactly. The Nobel Foundation's defense, which they still maintain even today, is essentially a defense of context. They argue there were no other alternatives at the time. They viewed Moniz as a bold pioneer who took a massive risk when the entire field of psychiatry was completely stagnant and hopeless.
They viewed it as a necessary evil, a harsh bridge to cross during a medical crisis.
Decades later, when the controversy flared up, a Swedish psychiatrist named Bengt Jansen wrote an essay defending the Nobel Committee's historical choice. He wrote, "I see no reason for indignation at what was done in the 1940s, as at that time there were no other alternatives."
But I'm sorry, I push back on that completely, and so does a large part of the modern scientific community. You can't just hand-wave away the lack of scientific rigor by saying, we were desperate.
And you are not alone in that outrage. The modern controversy surrounding this specific Nobel Prize is fierce. Torsten Wiesel, who is himself a highly respected Nobel laureate in medicine, has publicly and vehemently condemned the 1949 decision.
What did he say?
He stated on the record that awarding the prize to Moniz was a terrible mistake that caused permanent damage to thousands of patients.
Because it wasn't just a retroactive pat on the back. The prize had real-world, deadly consequences. When you give something the Nobel Prize, you legitimize it.
And that is the exact argument made by the families of the victims. There are active, passionate campaigns to have the Nobel Foundation officially revoke the 1949 prize. One of the most vocal advocates is a medical librarian named Christine Johnson. Her grandmother was lobotomized in 1954, years after the prize was awarded.
Johnson argues that the committee gave the procedure an unassailable stamp of absolute legitimacy. She said, through the committee's actions, they endorsed this brutal operation and provided justification for thousands of more operations.
And the data backs her up.
The numbers of lobotomies skyrocketed after Moniz won the prize. It made an experimental, dangerous surgery suddenly seem perfectly respectable to a skeptical public.
Another prominent campaigner, Sue Kemsley, stated very plainly, it would be nice if the Nobel Prize Committee would admit to their error, denobilize Egas Moniz, and dedicate his prize instead to the victims of psychosurgery.
So, as someone who studies the forensic evolution of science and the history of medical breakthroughs, I have to ask you, can you unring a bell? Should the Nobel Prize be revoked?
It is arguably the ultimate bioethical dilemma in modern science. It's a debate between presentism and legacy. On one hand, historians argue that you cannot judge history strictly by modern ethical standards. Moniz was working in an era of profound medical ignorance regarding the brain, trying to solve an intractable societal crisis.
Right.
Revoking the prize half a century later doesn't change history. It doesn't heal a single patient. Some argue it just whitewashes the Nobel Committee's own complicity, allowing them to pretend they weren't part of the medical zeitgeist of the 1940s.
Right. It lets the institution off the hook for reflecting the flaws of their own time. It's too easy to just erase him and say, oops, our bad.
Exactly. But on the other hand, a Nobel Prize isn't just a historical footnote in a textbook. It is a living, continuing endorsement of scientific excellence. Leaving the prize intact feels like an ongoing, daily insult to the tens of thousands of victims whose lives were permanently ruined by a procedure that lacked even basic scientific rigor. Every year that his name remains on that prestigious list, it validates a devastating error.
It's a debate that I don't think will ever be fully resolved, but there is one final, incredibly dark irony to the story of Egas Moniz himself. He didn't live long enough to see his procedure completely discredited and replaced by Thorazine, but he did suffer the consequences of his work in a very literal, violent way.
Yes. 10 years before he even won the Nobel Prize back in 1939, Moniz was violently attacked in his own medical office.
By one of his own patients.
An angry, severely paranoid patient whom Moniz had treated, smuggled a gun into the office and shot Moniz multiple times. One of the bullets struck his spine.
Wow.
The man who invented a surgery that paralyzed the emotional lives of tens of thousands of people was himself rendered a physical paraplegic for the rest of his life. He spent his final 16 years confined to a wheelchair, eventually dying in 1955.
It reads exactly like a Greek tragedy. The immense hubris, the desperate, unscientific pursuit of a miracle cure, the horrifying collateral damage inflicted on the vulnerable, and the ultimate poetic downfall of the architect.
It truly is. And as we close the case files on this deep dive tonight, I think we have to pause and reflect on the profound human cost. Because it's easy to get lost in the medical mechanics and the Nobel debates. But the lobotomy wasn't just a failure of medical science. It was a profound, deeply intimate family tragedy played out in thousands of living rooms across the world.
People like Rosemary Kennedy, Frances Farmer. But also so many unnamed people. The tired housewives, the returning shell-shocked soldiers, the rebellious teenagers who just didn't fit the mold. They were hidden away. Their personalities, their spark, the very essence of what made them human, was literally carved out and erased. And it was largely done in the name of making them manageable. It was done to save their families from the social embarrassment of mental illness.
And that brings us to the most uncomfortable question of all. The one that you, the listener, have to reckon with as we wrap this up. It is so incredibly easy for us, sitting here with our modern medicine, decades later, to look back at Walter Freeman and his ice pick and shudder. It's easy to judge the doctors of the 1940s as monsters.
But does looking back in horror actually prevent us from making the exact same structural mistakes today?
That's the core issue. The lobotomy was celebrated and rewarded because it made difficult, messy people compliant. It made them superficially productive members of a society that deeply valued efficiency over complex emotional reality. It offered a fast, cheap shortcut to a problem that required deep, sustained empathy.
So as you pack up your things and go about your week, ask yourself this in our modern, hyper-fast-paced rush for efficiency, in our modern desperation for quick fixes to complex psychological pain, are we still sometimes prioritizing societal conformity over a person's true, messy, complex mental well-being?
We rely heavily on pharmaceuticals today. And while they're vastly safer than a surgical pick, we have to ask, are we always treating the root cause of the human condition? Or are we sometimes just chemically enforcing compliance because it's easier for society to manage?
What accepted standard medical practices happening today, right now, in perfectly sterile, well-lit hospitals, will our grandchildren look back on in 50 years with the exact same creeping horror we feel when we look at that ice pick?
When you step into the world of the human mind, the diagnostic landscape is always murky. The mind is not a bone you can just set and cast. And if we aren't careful, if we let desperation or the desire for compliance override our humanity, the cure can become far, far worse than the disease.